If Christmas is the time to look back and reflect, then the new year is surely the time to look forward and at the future. And the future of the craft beer industry is something that I was thinking quite a lot about over the Christmas period. Bit weird, probably, but when you've got a YouTube channel that's kind of focused on the craft beer industry and you're planning things for the year ahead, it's kind of natural that you would end up thinking, how much longevity is in this? You know, how long can this go on for? This video is going to be a little bit different, a bit more serious, a bit more musing rather than amusing. Speaking of which, Paul is currently recovering from a bit of lurgy and he'll be back with me next week. What I want to do in this video is share an interesting message which I got during a half-cut conversation over the new year with somebody about the craft beer industry, the state it's in, and where it's possibly going to end up. This message came from a friend of mine called Mark, who's the owner of an independent bottle shop in Stourbridge called the Hop Vault. Now, the reason why I want to share this message with you is because I found it very interesting and it came out with some very insightful observations which played on my mind a bit and had me thinking. And by the end of the message, it actually got me thinking, could we be at a point where the craft beer scene will eat itself, or drink itself if you prefer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share that message with you. I'm going to read it out, stop along the way to interject with my opinions and my thoughts on what Mark said. And by the end of it, I'd actually really encourage you guys to have your say and drop us a comment and let us know your thoughts on the craft beer industry, where it's heading, and reactions obviously to what we've heard in this video. So with that, what did Mark say in this message? Well, when asked in the question what he thought about the craft beer industry and where it was heading, he started off with, I think we're in a weird transition period and the Pareto Principle is unavoidable. Now, I actually had to look up the Pareto Principle because I was unaware of it, so cheers, Mark. But essentially, it's a statistical concept which states that 80% of outcomes or outputs are a result of 20% of the inputs. It's also known as the 80-20 rule, and it's used quite a lot in business and stuff like that. But what does that mean for beer? Well, for example, it could be that when you looked at a brewery and its sales, 80% of those sales are actually made up of 20% of their beer types, for instance, their core range. It could also be that if you looked at a tap room or a bar, 20% of their customer base actually make up for 80% of their sales, which, when I think about it, that sounds about right for me in the Hop Vault. But I think what Mark was highlighting here is that if you looked at the craft beer industry as a whole, 80% of the sales that are made probably come from 20% of the breweries. And if we're thinking about that, I think we all know which breweries come to mind when we're thinking about who might fall into that 20%. We're kind of in craft phase 3 right now, assuming you accept that modern craft is its own thing, otherwise we're just in beer phase 50 odd or something. In phase 1, we had Brewdog and Beavertown, who were cool and then grew until they weren't cool anymore. I think that's quite an interesting thing to do actually there, where he's breaking it up into phases into the craft beer scene, especially if we look at it as the scene which we're looking at now, which is the one that started in the late 2000s and kind of stemmed from breweries that were trying to import these kind of American style IPAs that we hadn't had before. And in that case, the influence of Brewdog and Beavertown, whatever we may think of them now, I think it's undeniable, the mark that they've made. We've done quite a few interviews with brewers and breweries and stuff on the channel, and Punk IPA almost always pops up as an influential beer which kind of got them started or into the style. Same also with Gamma Ray, that's also featured a couple of times. But then when you get so big that Heineken come in and buy you, or you've got enough money in the bank to start opening up a bar in a casino on the Strip in Las Vegas, it's perhaps no surprise that the people that followed you up until this point in a scene which is quite countercultural and it's all about independence and small scale, it's no wonder then that they would start moving on to the next thing, kind of feeling like you may have sold out. Then in phase 2 we had Tiny Rebel, Vocation, Northern Monk, Buxton, etc., who were cool and then grew until they started popping up in normal pubs and supermarkets, and now they're mostly absent from the craft scene proper. Now that last bit about being absent from the scene may set the cat amongst the pigeons a little bit, maybe a bit controversial, but I still think it's a fair point to make that the breweries listed there in this phase 2, they did develop and grow with mainstream growth in mind. And for many of them, that meant moving into supermarkets. Now, is that a bad thing? I'd say that depends on who you ask. The answer's probably somewhere between yes and no. But as you'll know, on this channel, we've sat down with Russ and Brian, the co-founders from Northern Monk, and we've talked about their humble beginnings, and we've talked about where they are now and where they plan to go. And I think realistically, they've been very transparent about it. And if you kind of say the quiet bit out loud, it's very much that Northern Monk's growth plans are probably more in line with a brewery like Brewdog than they are with someone like Colonel, for instance, who've probably been around for the same amount of time. Now, I appreciate that a comparison with Brewdog is going to be a dirty thing, and I don't mean anything by that. And there's also absolutely nothing wrong with growing to the point of wanting the mainstream exposure. If your mission is to get craft beer out there and to as many people as possible and to convert people, then yeah, great, go and do that. But there will always come that point in a scene where it's all about being the David and not the Goliath. You will kind of have growing pains and you'll kind of find yourself at odds and maybe in a bit of an identity crisis about it. And now we have phase 3. Cloudwater, Dea, Verdant, who are next in line, but are all odd cases in that they seem reluctant to give up their cool and are trying to figure out how to grow without losing it. We saw what happened with Cloudwater. They essentially had to rebrand after the Tesco Brewdog fiasco. Yeah, I mean, hard to argue with any of that. I mean, our first video on this channel was with Cloudwater, or at least Connor, who was their head of marketing at the time. I think he's since moved on to Sure Shot. But I think it's fair to say that they kind of just underestimated how strongly the backlash would hit them about doing it. Now, did that backlash come because they went into supermarkets exclusively? Or was it the connection to Brewdog and the partnership that they had going there with terms to brewing it up in Ellen that was the issue? We could probably debate that, but we're not going to. Equally, Verdant, as yet, aren't in supermarkets, and I don't think they have any plans to, but that doesn't mean that they're not pursuing mainstream growth in different ways. And for that, I think you only need to look at what they did last year in January 2023, where they teamed up with the pub arm of Fuller's Brewery, and it was all about getting Lightbulb into all of those Fuller's pubs so that, you know, it would increase exposure with the everyman going in for his steak and mash. And yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing that. They're increasing their exposure, but they're doing it in ways which means that they're not going into supermarkets. So this phase 3, which Mark refers to it as, these newer breweries who aren't really that much newer, they've just had this kind of status that's been put upon them. They've been put on like a pedestal within the industry. They're kind of, I suppose, grappling with that a little bit to try and maintain their craft credentials in this feisty little scene that we've got, and they're trying to go about it their own way. It's not clear yet if you can have your cake and eat it. Breweries that want to push the beer envelope can't do that without the independent bottle shops. Wetherspoons ain't taking 200 kegs of 16% gingerbread stout to sell at £15 a pint, and Tesco likewise. If you want to do that stuff, you need independents to stock and push it, and they're not going to do that if you're going to put stuff in Tesco for £3 a can. And this, I think, is the crux of it, and it should come as no surprise that Mark, as someone who owns an independent beer shop in a high street, is very much championing the virtues of what a bottle shop can offer. And it's also fair to point out that I think breweries do need these independent bottle shops if they want to grow, and it's all part of the ecosystem. They're an important part of it. Equally, I'm still an advocate for the fact that breweries should be able to sell to and through whoever they like. And I'm not against direct-to-customer sales. But ultimately, breweries should not be surprised if bars and shops who survive on paper-thin margins, especially the ones that are in bricks and mortar, take a very dim view on selling into supermarkets, especially when you consider, realistically, that can and bottle sales in craft beer are a zero-sum game. So it seems there's a choice to be made. Do you want to be the sort of brewery that makes really good, interesting beer, or do you just want to sell as much beer as possible? The exception, of course, is Vault City, but they're an odd case, being the most high-profile sour-only brewery. That's certainly true regarding Vault City, although there are breweries out there that are doing comparable styles of beer and sours. Vault City are the only ones that have kind of got the market cornered in terms of something that's price accessible, as they're in the supermarkets generally. With regards to the rest of the point about whether it's a binary choice, where you can either make really good, interesting beer or you can sell lots of beer, I'm not sure it's necessarily as straightforward as that. I would probably counter that with Northern Monk, because I still think that Northern Monk's focus on doing things like the Patrons Project and their experimental small batch stuff pushes them forward, even though they've got their core range and Faith and stuff like that in supermarkets. So I think they're a good example of one that still manages the balancing act, but equally, what do you think? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. Now, at this point, Mark references Wetherspoons in relation to something which I'd said earlier on, kind of half-jokingly, but about whether we could end up seeing some of our favourite craft beers and craft breweries in Wetherspoons. Wetherspoons is a weird one in that they buy up short-date stuff in bulk, and if more craft breweries start doing more cask, as we saw in 2023, we could see them having to get rid of it, and Wetherspoons might be a good option. Big if true. Now, at face value, that's a pretty wild claim, but I could actually now point you to a bit of anecdotal evidence from my friend Steve, who on New Year's Day went down to London, and he was in a Wetherspoons near Ali Pali. He sent me a photo of the craft beer selection there. Now, for a Wetherspoons, I'm going to whack the pictures up on screen now so you can see it, but for a Wetherspoons, this is a pretty remarkable selection of craft beer, and we're not talking about crap stuff, you know, Anspach and Hobday, Burning Sky, Fierce, Signature. I mean, it's only one Wetherspoons, and it is one that's in London, but equally, it's quite interesting to see that. And now we head into the final part of his message, and at this point, Mark references a pub which is local to us called the Wagon and Horses. They're basically a classic old man pub, focuses on real ales, but last year they put in some craft beer lines, and they've got a little section at the back on the back bar where they've now got a craft beer selection on. The other thing which will likely happen is more pubs going the way of the Wagon and just sticking in a craft bar without really any knowledge or dedication. Then it may come down to wholesalers. Most of those pubs are at least functionally tied to specific wholesalers, so it may end up being that the deals breweries strike with wholesalers become really influential on the proliferation of certain beers. At the moment, places like us, as in the Hop Vault, shop around to get what we want, but the Wagon just pick from a list, and how that list is curated affects what ends up on the bar. Now again, that's something which I just found was a fascinating insight, and not one that had really ever crossed my mind because, well, I don't order from wholesalers and I don't have a pub, so it's something which I've never thought of, but actually, yeah, we could start seeing a rise in pubs riding the craft wave and putting their own in, but actually the selection is just coming from your standard list of wholesalers. And then Mark finishes off with a fascinating observation really, and a bit of anecdotal evidence. It's also interesting to note the breweries that have done significant discounting in the last year. Verdant, Deya and Polly's all offered big discounts to get rid of kegs, which is something we've not seen before, but we're pretty new. I would assume that they increased production in response to demand, but then saw demand drop off. Not sure why, but interesting nonetheless. Yeah, I mean, that is pretty interesting. There's not really much I can add to it, obviously with it being anecdotal and his truth. And yeah, while there could be all manner of reasons why Hop Vault are managing to pick up discounted kegs of Verdant, Deya and Polly's, Occam's razor and all that, I'd say the simplest answer is usually the correct one. It would also kind of ring true, I think. We know that Verdant and Deya, perhaps Polly's, I'm not sure, they've all increased production and capacity over the year, and obviously we've had that at the same time as a massive cost of living crisis and people tightening the belts and not spending as much money on beer. So those two things converging could result in that. But what do you think? I mean, let me know. There's no real big conclusion in this. I'm not about to come out with something that's like a big revelation or what's right or what's wrong. Just something I wanted to get this message out because it really interested me, and the future of craft beer is actually something that I think we could explore going ahead. Let's get a conversation started because we don't do this much, and by all means, if you want to take it up with Mark personally, then go and check out the Hop Vault on Market Street in Stourbridge. Ask for Mark, buy him a drink and argue with him because he does love a good argument. Anyway, that's it for this one. Yeah, see you next time.